This is Raphael.
And I'm Loryn.
We're the Pacheco siblings, and welcome to the Hypercube podcast, a talk show in which two siblings converse about anything and everything. Alrighty, how we doing?
Doing all right.
Yeah, so I suppose we don't have a lot of room left in this season, and we had some other things that we were expecting to do that kind of fell through, but I think this might be a good opportunity to revisit a topic that we'd recorded an episode for in the first season, but that kind of disappeared. That was the lost episode.
Yeah.
That we have referenced a few times. That I think we just lost the file for.
Yeah.
And
I think it was my file that went missing, or I didn't export it, or something happened.
Something happened. Either way, we could never locate your file. And there was a lot of good stuff in that episode, but one of them was the fact that we had an impromptu Did You Know segment from back when we were still doing those.
Yeah.
In which we talked about virtual production. And we kind of have been meaning to revisit that because it was full of so much good content. And this is a subject that I think both have a lot of ideas about.
Oh, for sure.
And a lot of interest in, because, and I think a lot of filmmakers have a lot of interest in it right now. It's a bit of a burgeoning, I don't even want to say industry, because it's not really a separate industry. It's just part of the film industry, but it's, I guess, a burgeoning methodology that is becoming more and more commonplace.
It's a pipeline,
and there are
really.
more and more. Yeah, a pipeline. I think that's a good word for it. And there's just increasingly more resources for it as time goes on. And I think we're only going to see those resources increase because, in my opinion, it is primed to be the future of filmmaking as we know it in many ways. But yeah, I would love to talk about it again. And I think what prompted us the first time was this short film that you'd shown me called Irradiation. We'll link it in the show notes. But it was a pretty good little, basically like cosmic horror short film. I really enjoyed it. It's really great. I recommend giving it a watch.
Done entirely in...
Was it Unreal?
I want to say it was one of those U ones, Unreal or Unity.
It's always
my
either
guess is Unreal.
Unreal or Unity are like the mainstream ones. I know. Yeah, I think I want to say Unreal as well. Unreal definitely seems to get a lot more press. And I think it's partly because they've been the rendering engine behind some pretty high profile examples of virtual production. And also they're very much marketing the latest version of Unreal Engine as a virtual production tool, right? Like they are very much leaning into that, which is kind of cool to see in many ways. But first, let's get into the subject. So we want to do a bit of a deep dive here. And I think we should start by defining our terms because not everybody might yet realize what exactly virtual production is. So I think you'd probably be better suited to give a definition than I am. How would you describe virtual production?
So there's a lot of different, like conflicting, not like conflicting, but a lot of different things that can all kind of fall under like the umbrella of virtual production. Because virtual production, like you said, it's more like a process, right? It's not like a individual specific technology. A lot of different technologies all come together to create a virtual production. So when you think of virtual production, it's like that process. If you want to just kind of like condense it, virtual production is a filmmaking technique that allows filmmakers to merge traditional practices like cameras and actors with ongoing advances in real-time technology, such as you were talking about like Unity or Unreal. So being able to use an actual set or an actual actor or an actual something in the traditional filmmaking sense, combined with all this new stuff that's going on with just game engines and real-time rendering technologies, and merging them. Anything that falls under those two, or anything that falls under that like category, can be considered a virtual production. Yeah,
in which to clarify as well, for those who might be outside of that culture, right? These are like Unreal, Unity, and the things like that. These are video game, traditionally used as video game engines.
Yeah,
and so video games famously can render basically 3D images in real time is one of their advantages, which traditional 3D animation takes a long time, right? Because you have to render out each frame at a very high fidelity and it just takes a long time, right? Hundreds of hours.
We could have
render anything usable for like a feature animated film.
We could have an entire podcast episode just talking about the differences in real-time rendering and I guess like ray trace rendering, like, traditional 3D rendering, where because like even the differences in that in and of itself is massive, because real time. What real time basically does is it uses a ton of shortcuts to basically emulate what it would look like for light to bounce around a scene, or just creating like shaders, which is a shader is just how the light interacts with the camera, or creating shaders that have its own unique look that doesn't have to do any of that complex math of like light bouncing around a scene, creating like ambient occlusion and creating like all these reflective surfaces or anything like that. Just in you get like these like toon shaders and all that other stuff. It's like you can get like those games or low poly games or anything like that, where it's like you can take those shortcuts, you can make those like artistic decisions to remove like the realistic side of like real-time rendering, or of normal traditional like 3D rendering. But if you want to do 3D traditional rendering, every single light source is like emitting rays that have math all done to it. Every single frame can take minutes to upwards of hours to do all that math for all those rays to get back to the camera and produce and to produce an image. That's not useful to a filmmaker if you want to do real time and in real time, and also productions where you want to have everything, mind you,
like 24 frames per second
in 24 or more 24 frames or more.
Yeah, that's true. But typically a film is rendered at 24 frames per second. So these are like what you're seeing in, say, Pixar or Disney, those kinds of mainstream animated films, 3D animated films. That's the kind of rendering you're seeing in those films.
Yeah,
is these like hours per frame, 24 frames per second. It's a very intensive pipeline and requires very powerful computers.
Mm-hmm.
But real-time rendering that you see in, for example, video games, that does not require nearly as powerful a computer. Still a pretty powerful one, but not nearly as much. And it could render way more imagery way faster.
60 frames, 120 frames.
Yeah. And it's continually getting better. Like if you see the latest AAA video game titles, you're probably seeing some pretty crazy imagery on current generation consoles or computers that's all rendered in real time. And that's basically virtual production takes advantage of that, to use that as a filmmaking tool to basically use animation in real time as part of a real-time production process involving actors and so on.
And like also getting into the weeds a little bit, there's also a kind of like caveat when it comes to like real-time technology, right? Because I think Radiation did this as well when they were in production, but basically you can do a thing in 3D technologies or 3D modeling or 3D programs. You could turn on and off different layers or shaders or different modifiers to your scene to kind of like make it low poly, make it run a little faster. So what you can do is have this insanely detailed scene, turn down like all the subsurface or like all of like the high quality textures that you have on it, so that you can actually run the scene in real time, like maybe on like a lower end laptop or something like that, right? Or run on a pretty accessible piece of hardware. Run your thing in real time, do whatever you need to do, and then for the render, crank it back up and have that super hyper realistic thing, and that's still considered real time.
That is true,
because like that it doesn't have to look like the latest Call of Duty game while you're filming. You can crank it down, do like really low poly stuff, and then just kind of get the idea of like the blocking of the scene.
And pick your camera angles.
And then once you get to the render, because everything has to eventually, be put into like a file that you can, upload to the internet or put onto a disk. Once you get to that point, crank everything back up, and then you have your hyper realistic scene, which you envisioned in the first place, but is not what you were using to film. Still considered real time.
Yeah. Which, yes, we can get into the weeds of that, because that's the methodology that I think is used on a lot of blockbuster films that use this kind of pipeline. And so we'll get to that in a second. So I think that's the point where we should dive into the history of this thing.
Yeah.
Because virtual production is a bit of a recent development. It's actually still fairly new, which is
kind
of
of
crazy to think about. kind of fairly
Kind
new. We will get into the astraces in a moment, but it is fairly new though, right? Overall, in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of animation history, say for example, it is fairly new. But I guess 3D in general is fairly new on
that's the thing.
on that stage.
So like if you take tons of caveats, right? Because like if you take the definition, which
it depends on how much you abstract it.
Because like the most abstract version is any filmmaking technique that combines traditional filmmaking practices with real-time technology. The thing is, real-time technology does not have to mean 3D. Some people consider old uses of rear projection to be a form of virtual technology or virtual production. And if you want to include that, it is really old. Like virtual productions can be really old. If you want to include everything under the scope of real-time technology, which because then film is a real-time technology. You watch a film in real time. If you then project a film into your film, you have combined traditional practices of filming with actors on a set with this, heavy air quotes, pre-rendered scene.
Yeah. In a sense, yeah. I suppose if you think of it that way, but then I guess any old compositing techniques would be sort of the same, wouldn't it?
Well, as long as it's done in camera. This is the difference. It has to be done on the set in camera.
Well, which, to be fair, could have been done. There are very early techniques for doing compositing like on set, like capturing it in camera, which I had no clue about the history until a series of Corridor VFX Artist Reacts episode where they talked about the prism, as they colloquially call it, which is a very fascinating lost piece of visual effects history. Which, it was like there was like this crazy prism that was developed by Disney to create real-time compositing. It was used in Mary Poppins and films like that. But basically, I
think I know what this is.
Refracted light. There was like some sort of special gas involved, and the prism refracted light in a very special way. Yeah, basically, and they used it to create very interesting real-time rendering technology or real-time compositing technology that was all captured in camera, and it's mind-blowing stuff. But apparently they only made so many of these things, and they probably exist in a vault still somewhere. But it's generally been lost to time because Disney preserves everything. And they always joke that Walt Disney's soul is somewhere in one of those prisms.
I wouldn't doubt it. To go along with his head. But
his brain that's preserved somewhere.
That technology, I believe, was developed off of old, like when we literally get the term smoke and mirror, that's where that's where it comes from. This was technology, I think, that was like derived from stuff that people used to fake seances and to fake ghost sightings and all this other stuff, where they would take photos and they would have it would overlay onto one photograph two different images and two different scenes because of some mirrors and some, light refraction or whatever they need to do. And they would get light coming from two different sources from two different scenes onto the same film. And that's how they would like fake these, like, hey, I'm going to take a photo of you and your dead grandma is going to be in the photo. It's like, oh, man, no, it's not. And you take a photo. It's like, whoa, it's my dead grandma, but it's just some guy off screen. And like a weird outfit that you then overlay onto the normal film. And like, that's literally where smoke and mirrors comes from. And I think that's the tech.
It's old illusionist.
It's old. I mean, everything comes back to magic, right? But
right.
It's all the same technology, just kind of repurposed for entertainment instead of like weird.
Yeah. And scamming people or something.
But people do it for all different kinds of reasons. Like there's a really famous example of this group of people who were like they were trying to convince as many people as they could that they had some kind of extrasensory or like some kind of power or whatever, right? So they got a bunch of skeptics who were like, hey, we want people in this room who will not believe us, right? We don't want to get people who are just going to like go along with it, who are just going to say anything that we want them to, repeat back to the audience. Like we want to get skeptics in here. And one of them famously was, what's the author of?
Oh, you're talking about
Doyle,
the Sherlock Holmes author?
The Sherlock Holmes author.
Yeah, Arthur
Conan Doyle. One of them was Arthur Conan Doyle. So they got all these people in this room and they did like the seance. I think they did a bunch of different experiments and to prove the existence of the supernatural, right? And convinced, I think most, not all of them. And then at the end of it, they're like, okay, what was your experience? What happened? And like, I believe I had a genuine spiritual experience. And like, wow, it's fascinating because we're filmmakers. And what we actually did was And like real illusionists, and we use all this new technology to basically fool you. And what do you think about that? And Arthur Conan Doyle said, "It's like, I think it's still real."
Yeah,
fascinating stuff.
He famously got very, very intrigued by that kind of spiritualism stuff in his later years.
But like that whole stuff, but that was one of the things that they used was the photography kind of like
those kinds of techniques.
Yeah.
Well, so that's getting off into the weeds a bit. Again, that's a
Let's
heavy abstraction of what virtual production is. So the virtual production that we're talking about,
for our current uses.
Recent. For our current uses and the way that most people understand it, right? Because the coinage of the term is also very recent.
That is very recent.
It's the coinage of the term that is specifically referring to a kind of process that is, in fact, very recent. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that history, the modern history of virtual production as it's popularly understood.
Yeah, because the current use of virtual production, I think the word virtual production, I think, was first used in 2009. I don't think I can find an earlier version than that. It was for James Cameron's Avatar. I think that was the first time that they used that term virtual production to describe what they were doing, right? Because it's like in Avatar, is it animated? Is it live action? It's really confusing if you just kind of like, if you try to apply these preconceived, like these old antiquated definitions of like what is film, what kinds of movies can there be? It gets really confusing. Like, what is this film? Like, what even is it? Like, it's a mix of both. So they had to come up with a new term to describe what it is they were doing. And so virtual production was the term they landed on. And that used a heavy mix of, live action performances by the actors with cameras on their faces to capture facial performances, as well as motion capture suits that would give motion data to people to then later clean up in animation, and actual just
performance capture
combined with actual people on set interacting with 3D environments or interacting with green screen environments that would then be overlaid with 3D. But it combined all these elements for the first time, and they came up with the word, or they came up with the term virtual production. That was the first time it was used, I believe. Again, I can't find anything earlier than that, but that is not the earliest time that this technique was being used. They didn't have that name yet, because I think that can go back to like Lord of the Rings with characters like Smeagol.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's interesting, because I mean, it was certainly an early PCAP, but I don't know if I would qualify it as virtual production.
It's hard to say, right? Because like,
there wasn't, I mean, which even then the PCAP was very jank. Apparently
I think they ended up hand animating it anyways.
Used. Yeah, they ended up hand animating it. It was essentially glorified reference.
Yeah. But either
it's all like with Gollum, I think that's a bit of a hard sell. But certainly, I think by the time you get to 2008, 2009, is Avatar, that you really start to get a solidified idea of how a process like this can actually work. I remember my first encounter with it, and maybe you have the year and date for this one, is Iron Man 2. I remember seeing the behind the scenes for that. Right. That was very shortly after Avatar. They basically used the exact same style of pipeline on it.
Yeah.
Where they would have basically like a soundstage and a camera that basically looked into the virtual environment, the 3D rendered environment, and rendered like a real-time version of it. And they just grabbed camera angles of the 3D sequence as if they were like moving a camera about the environment. And I thought I remember seeing that in the behind the scenes of that film way back then. And my mind was blown. First of all, I thought that was the coolest thing, but I didn't realize that was the beginnings of something that would be really huge, which is Jon Favreau experimenting with virtual production.
Yeah. So that was the year after. That was 2010.
2010. Wow. Yeah. So it was just 1 year later. Jon Favreau's being like, "Hey, that was pretty cool. What
that was
James
a cool
Cameron
idea.
Did a year ago." Yeah, that was. Well, I say a year ago. James Cameron was working on that movie for a long time. So no doubt, industry insiders like Favreau were hearing about these processes as they were happening.
Yeah.
And getting ideas, because I don't think Favreau did anything like that on the first Iron Man. Actually,
that was traditional animation.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of costumes too. A lot more costumes.
They
ever
a
used
lot
on an
more
Iron
done
Man
in
film after that.
A lot more done in actual physical props.
Yeah. So they didn't really have any animated sequences that were so elaborate that they, beckoned that kind of process. So yeah, Iron Man 2 was another place very shortly thereafter where they started doing the same thing. And I remember that was my first exposure to virtual production personally. But Jon Favreau is a name to remember because he kind of carries virtual production into like basically all the rest of its history from there on out.
No, for sure. He took it and he ran. Like he was like, pass me the ball, coach. I'll do it. 2010, yeah, Iron Man 2. He starts experimenting with this, but like it's still very early in its conception, right? Because like they didn't really in 2009. I don't think they were using the same kind. Like it was a virtual production in that that's where the term was coined, but I don't think they were using the same kind of thing with overlaying 3D images in real time at the same time as the footage that they were capturing. A lot of it was still used as like reference.
Well, maybe and I think Avatar would, because that's true. It's worth noting these were slightly different pipelines insofar as Avatar, they were capturing like PCAP on a soundstage.
Yeah.
Whereas like in Iron Man 2, animation, everything like that was already finished. They just used a virtual camera to go into the animated environment and capture it that way. But I think on Avatar, they had a virtual camera as well. But that one was definitely a more complete virtual production set.
Yeah. Because like you take those two ideas, right? And then you start to combine them. And that's where we get the modern concept of virtual production, of taking footage of characters combined with overlaying 3D camera into the scene, is using the 3D camera and the physical camera as the same thing, in that same, that's the same point of view. That's when we start to get the idea of the modern idea of virtual production. Because while the term was used back then, it was slightly different from how it is now. If only just because the technology changed. The technology got better. They had these prototypes, iterated on it, did more experiments, and several years down the line, we get The Lion King, which was in 2009, which was 9 years later after Iron Man 2. And The Lion King...
Wait, The
Lion King was the first 2009? Movie... 2019 is what I meant. 2019.
Oh, sorry.
2009, James Cameron's Avatar. 2019, The Lion King, the heavy air quotes live action Lion King. That was the first time that the modern idea of virtual production was kind of used, where the live action camera and the 3D camera were all kind of using the same thing. And again, Jon Favreau pioneering and
once again
taking this idea and just absolutely running with it, doing an entire production this way. Because like it used to be that would like in Iron Man 2, that was used for specific scenes. Avatar was more or less the whole movie was done in like it was shot in like 3 different stages combined together all at the end. And for Lion King, the entire film was done this way.
Right. Or was it The Lion King or The Jungle Book first?
It was The Lion King. Jon Favreau's Lion King. I think
Jon Favreau's Jungle Book.
Jon Favreau's Jungle Book.
His heavy air quotes live action Jungle Book.
Heavy air quotes.
Because I know they both basically use the same process. I just can't remember chronologically which one came first.
No. The Jungle Book did come first. No. I remember what it was. He did the Jungle Book first. Used the same process for The Lion King. What's important about The Lion King was when he did that, he was like, hey, we're doing this again, but I need to be able to explain to people what we're doing. What was important about the 2019 Lion King was that was the first time people had sat down and formalized the definition of virtual production instead of just like colloquially saying, what we're doing is virtual production. What is that? Whatever we're doing is virtual production.
Right. Because he had to pitch it. He had to pitch it to Disney.
Yeah. So he sat down and they created a book of terms, a glossary for virtual productions. And I believe this was published through like, Technicolor. Technicolor, they have this manual and you can find this online. You can find this. I have it.
This is a thing that exists.
Links down in the show notes of what they used. The glossary.
Primo academic article, basically on the original academic formation of formalization even of what virtual production is.
Yep. Updated.
Commissioned by Jon Favreau.
Updated January of 2019, quick reference virtual production glossary. And all it is just defining all of these terms. Like, I'm just going to read through the context really quick, right? Like, first one, virtual production. Yeah, data capture, aspect ratio, augmented reality, eye tracking, immersion, latency, refresh rate, witness cameras. It goes on. And it just like all of these terms, which nowadays, like we kind of understand, like, oh yeah, like eye tracking technology. You can get like, what's the worst word? You can get like commercial software to track your eyes. But what does that mean for film, right? They had to define and formalize and they had to standardize all these terms. And like, what is it exactly that we mean when we say this, so that we can hand this off to different departments along with this little handbook and say what, and we all are on the same page.
Yeah. Which, oh my goodness, it's hard to overstate how important that is. And that's kind of a big revolution in and of itself.
Yeah.
That there was
huge.
a moment to like kind of formalize and standardize these terms for a production pipeline on a Disney blockbuster film that is being shot entirely in virtual production.
Because whether we like it or not, like whatever Disney does becomes the standard.
Yes, yeah. There's definitely a trickle down effect on techniques that are used at that scale to the rest of the industry.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the first time it had been put into writing what virtual production is. And I think the definition that I gave earlier comes from this book. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, that's the definition I gave earlier. So that general idea, that general definition of virtual production, that comes from this book. The first definition, the first term, virtual production, boom. Filmmaking technique that allows filmmakers to merge traditional practices with current and ongoing advances in real-time technology. That is the first definition, official definition of virtual production, even though it had been used many years prior.
I need to get my hands on this PDF. I'm definitely going to look at that in the show notes once we're through this.
It's good.
That sounds like a juicy resource. Oh my goodness.
I mean, like for being what, 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago at this point. It's like you can see how this just like completely changed the entire landscape of not only how virtual productions were done, but just any productions were kind of done.
Yeah.
Big,
really
big productions we're talking.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Which you could see the influences of that, because even you saying that, just how many years ago that was, I'm like, yeah, that was very recent. And you could kind of see the ripple effects that has had in the innovations in virtual production that have been done since then and that have been created and developed.
Yeah.
Because this, I think, ties into the next kind of stage in the evolution.
Yep.
Which also from Jon Favreau.
Again.
Which is, I mean, obviously Jon Favreau's, yeah, he's doing his thing. It's really hard to overstate how impactful Jon Favreau has been. I mean, I have a lot of respect for him as a filmmaker. However, also as there are a few filmmakers who I really respect as like innovators as well, right? Like people like Christopher Nolan, who are very interested in the science of the technology behind filmmaking as well. And I think Favreau's in that same sort of boat, but for a completely different reason.
Yeah.
But basically the same thing, like for real time, for virtual production, he is really like kind of the godfather of it. Even if James Cameron and his crew were the ones who coined the term, it's very much Jon Favreau who did the innovation that and the developmental work that turned virtual production into a formalized process. And not only that, did a lot of work to make it more accessible. And
that's a big thing.
On way bigger variety of projects. Whereas, Cameron was kind of more obsessed with a single franchise using this methodology. And essentially for him, I think the methodology was designed for the franchise instead of the other way around.
Yeah. Because he created the idea of Avatar like freaking somewhere in the 90s or something like that. And he was like, hey, I have this idea for a movie. And they're like, technology to create this movie literally doesn't exist. And he was like, okay. We'll see. And then I'll wait. And then proceeded to wait until the technology existed to create the film. Where Jon Favreau took that technology that already existed, that was created for Avatar, and then used that to create films, it's a different approach, but it's still worth noting.
But again, definitely some accolades I think we owe Favreau because, and I'm sure history is going to look back and remember even if he wasn't, per se like one of the engineers or scientists that actually developed these technologies, he was definitely a driving force, and his creativity and the spirit of the projects he was working on and leading were definitely a driving factor in the rapid development of virtual production in even the very recent history. And I think history is definitely going to look back on that and remember just how much of an innovator he was for that part of the industry and for these techniques that are now becoming very expansive. But that's going to get into my conclusory point later of why I think this technology is important and why these processes are important. But for now, let's get to the next point in the historical timeline, because that kind of leads, obviously he does Lion King and makes a lot of money because Disney, but he's making so many hits for Disney that Disney just loves keeping him around. And so what better place to put him than on another big Disney franchise? You've got their Lucasfilm department, and he gets to do Star Wars next. And that leads to the next big quantum leap. Again, by Jon Favreau, which is, he was, I believe, the creator, showrunner for The Mandalorian. And The Mandalorian is a whole new ballpark of virtual production.
An entirely different approach to virtual production.
Yes. So let's talk about that, because that's new. And I don't think anybody
big
even considered doing that before Jon Favreau came along and be like, what if we turned the whole virtual production thing inside out?
Yeah, like literally inside out. So like the thing is, the virtual productions we were talking about before was still stuck to a computer. Like you needed a computer to see your anything that was going on, right? Like the characters, or either the actors on set, were still interacting with green screen environments, and they still had PCAP suits on that had probably not very comfortable, but
and they still not always green screen, like Avatar and whatnot. That's all just soundstage, because they don't need the green screen. They just need the data.
Sure. Well, in the scenes where there were actors in the scenes with the avatars, they did use green screens. Where but like again, it's split into a lot of different. So many different techniques. Because like there was they combined a bunch of different ways to do it, but like they did have that kind of thing, like where it was all PCAP and mocap, and then also with green screen where they had actors actually interacting with the avatars, and then all this other stuff. But so that was you still had a virtual camera, which is important. Well, you had this virtual camera that would project in post your scene into whatever it is you're shooting on set. However,
and worth noting, those obviously, Iron Man 2, Avatar, Lion King, all that, like, worth noting, they would render those out more thoroughly later, right? Obviously, that is not real-time rendering that you see in the final film.
That is, it is replaced with the final render.
Yes, it was just used to basically give the filmmakers an eye into that virtual world while they're on set.
Basically used for like location scouting levels of
view, and view finding while you're shooting.
View finding, you're getting angles and field of view, that kind of stuff. But
and just making real time cinematography decisions using the virtual environment and virtual camera. So that's essentially the way they use it there. But Mandalorian comes along and they do something completely different.
Because that was somewhere between production and post production, right? Like it's in that kind of like middle ground, because like it exists in both. Then Jon Favreau says, wait a minute, hold on. What if, get this, what if everything was in camera, physically on set? And it's like, how do you do that? Just period. It's like what if it was just all in camera? Like, what if we don't need to like wait until later to render it out and replace all the, replace those temp scenes with our actual scenes? What if we didn't need to do that? And so that's like, how the heck do you even, what are you talking about? What are you talking about, Willis? So then he invents, he pioneers, he does the thing, and he creates a soundstage with a giant LED wall to project onto the wall what is happening in real time. So you have someone off on the side is still with a laptop or with a computer running Unity, but will have the scene. They will have Unreal. And they will have the scene projected onto the backdrop, which will then cast real light, real shadows, real color onto a real set that an actor, no mocap needed, can walk into full, old Star Wars style, full makeup, full costume, walk onto that set and see the things that they are interacting with. A ship goes flying by overhead. They see the ship goes flying by overhead. And that ship will cast real shadows. It'll cast real light and reflections. They could have the ship, they can build a physical version of his ship, put it onto the scene, cast, an image of like a city off in the distance, and you will see that in the reflection of his ship completely in camera. no compositing necessary. Well, maybe a little bit, just like, clean it up, because it's still a Hollywood production. I'm not going to say there was no compositing and no VFX added afterwards, because that would be just a lie.
Right.
But the bulk of the work entirely in camera. Yeah. And that completely changed what virtual production could even be, because now you have the freedom to have an actor physically see and interact with things in real time on a set, as opposed to still kind of doing that, green screen or soundstage empty set, mime their actions, put it into post, and then see then what the scene looks like in camera in actual real time, in a physical camera with real lenses and real light. For the first time, you could see basically what the final image is going to look like. Yeah.
Which was pretty mind-blowing, I think, for everybody in the industry at that time. And still is mind-blowing to me, honestly.
Still mind-blowing.
But because basically and that's what I mean by it basically turned the whole process inside out, right?
Literally inside
out. Before you had a virtual camera, right, to basically control the camera work in the virtual environment. Now instead you had a physical camera that was just shooting a real-time projection of the virtual environment. It was basically, I liken it to rear projection that you would see in older movies, basically modernized, because they're literally just projecting or in any way kind of displaying the virtual set onto the background of their actual set. Yeah. Right. And you're just getting, because it's using real-time engines like Unreal, like Unity, like these engines that are used to make modern video games, they can render pretty photorealistic 3D imagery in real time and just project that on set. Yeah. And like you said, it completely changes, from what I've heard of people who work on those kinds of productions, completely changes the vibe on set, right? Because 100%. Before, to do those kinds of scenes, you're just on a green screen, right? You're getting Gandalf tears. No Gandalf tears on this set, because the actors can see what they're interacting with. They can see the virtual world that they're a part of. It's way more immersive for the performers.
Way more immersive.
Way more like realistic lighting, because you're not dealing with having to composite in reflections on surfaces or anything like that. Control. Or take into, right? You don't need a VFX artist to be rigorously keeping track of that continuity. You just put it there. The light reflects the way it would, because there's actual light on set that's coming off of these virtual images. And speaking of Gandalf tears, like I don't think they would have been able to get a guy like Werner Herzog on that project if they hadn't, if they'd done this any other way, because he's just a very serious filmmaker. And that's like, I think he would have been turned off by showing up to like a Star Wars set with
a traditional like
full
in
green
prequel
screen, like
style
blue screen backgrounds. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, George Lucas would have scared Herzog away. Not Jon Favreau. Jon Favreau was like, I know how we can get Herzog here, and it's just like, check this out.
That's the entire reason he developed this, was to get Herzog on set.
No doubt. Yeah. And then Herzog probably said something very existential in response to seeing this breakthrough new technology, and went on a whole philosophical diatribe. But it's utterly, it's hard to describe how game changing that is for performers who actually get to see the otherworldly environments that they get to be a part of.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the technology is just so impressive in and of itself. And not only that, worth noting also, the virtual backgrounds are synchronized to the camera, to the gyroscopes in the camera, that basically allow it to, what do you call this? Parallax, where it's like you can
realistic.
The way the camera moves the background in turn, and so you could literally like look around the virtual environment and the perspective matches.
It turns the physical camera into the virtual camera, whereas those were two separate things originally, and you had to sync them like in post or manually. Now they are one and the same.
Exactly. Which, again, pretty mind-blowing stuff. And evidently, I know it was a lot of R&D up front, but evidently they made it pretty reproducible, right? They made a pipeline that was in a process that evidently they could repeat ad nauseum, because they've been doing that season after season of The Mandalorian, right?
Yeah.
And so this is, and a bunch of other Disney shows now and Star Wars shows. So this technology, even though it was a lot of work to get it off the ground, is now something that apparently is pretty like easy to scale and to reproduce and to use for all sorts of projects, be them commercials or anything else, any other kinds of films. Like, and this is, I don't know if they have a patent on it specifically from Disney or anything like that, but whatever it is, like this general workflow that they created for The Mandalorian, it's clearly something that they can pretty easily and possibly pretty cheaply do a lot more of.
Yeah.
Because they seem to be doing a lot of it, which means I'd imagine it, they've got a good workflow down to be able to do it more and more.
It is worth noting that The Mandalorian was also 2019. So it could have been...
Wait, it was?
Yeah. It could have been a case where there was simultaneous development on The Lion King and Mandalorian at the same time, or at least the technology that would go into The Mandalorian, and then they would use that for that production.
Okay, good to know. Yeah.
Yeah, I have no confirmation of like how that timeline is.
Right,
because
that's
like
purely speculative.
Yeah, because it is worth noting Lion King came out in 2019. Mandalorian also came out in 2019.
Right, yeah. Yeah, because that's true. Like, the Mandalorian was probably a faster production, too, than The Lion King. So
yeah,
who knows how that lines up. But yeah, that is worth noting. And that is very interesting. I didn't realize The Mandalorian was that early. But
apparently.
Yeah. So where does that bring us today, though? Because this is the big scale Disney level, Jon Favreau projects level of the kind of view. But to kind of bring us to a conclusory note, why I think this technology is important is because it's part of a long trend of history.
Mm-hmm.
History in general, but especially very recent history in the information age.
Yeah.
Which is the pattern of the democratization of art.
Yeah.
And here's what I mean by that. Here's what virtual production looks like for a lot of people today. That's, like I said, the largest scale version of the technology that was developed for these big blockbuster projects.
Yeah.
The smaller scale version of that is something that a lot of small independent creators are now doing, which is what the short film that I referenced at the beginning is doing. It's what people like Eric Jacobus's company, I can't remember the name of it right now, but they work in the virtual production space as well using Unreal. It's what all these, I think Ian Hubert, you showed me some stuff from him that's basically virtual production, but in a whole different way using Blender. So you're seeing a lot of smaller scale independent creators basically now feeling empowered to use real-time rendering to create hybrid, like live action animated projects, or sometimes purely animated projects just in real time that allow them to create films at a scale that was previously inaccessible to independent creatives, right? It used to be, if you're an independent creative, if you were not getting that big studio money, like a blockbuster, the style of films that we consider blockbuster films, like say an Avengers or anything like that, would be completely out of your reach, right? You could never make Terminator on your own, or with you and your small indie studio.
Yeah, it would be just completely out of reach.
Exactly. But now, thanks to virtual production, there's a lot more things you could do in 3D that would be crazy expensive to do on your own at an indie scale for live action. And so now you're seeing those kinds of projects are becoming more and more accessible. Those kinds of stories, if somebody wants to tell them, more and more possible, because 3D has assets, it's got communities, it's got resources that are all very much collaborating and, interchanging with one another, sharing their resources to make 3D pretty accessible. And that's getting more and more every day. The sheer amount of resources that you have to be able to get into that space. And so, and that stuff's getting more widespread. It's getting cheaper. It's getting all of that. And so now you've got creatives who are using basically real-time rendering engines to create types of projects and stories that were previously purely the domain of studios. And it's all because of this technology. But like I said, that's just one part of a larger trend towards the democratization of art. It used to be certain kinds of stories were in the domains of certain kinds of people with money, people with status. And generally, history trends away from that, right? At first, it's only Shakespeare that can write plays like that. But now you can do it at your small independent theater because, you've got literacy, you've got all sorts of things that have changed since then. That have become more widespread. And so this is just really another cog in that machine, another step in that large process of history And it's really impressive to see how this is unlocking creativity for so many independent filmmakers, ourselves included, right? This now, it is conceivable that we can make like an Avengers style project within our lifetime without ever entering the studio system. And that's kind of insane to think about.
Yeah, for sure. There's a guy who completely 100% agrees with you named Deepak Chetty. He's got this quote: virtual production is not new, it's just been democratized. Now, who do you think Deepak Chetty is?
He sounds Indian.
He sounds Indian. Yes, it's true. He works with Unreal, with the Unreal Engine. I believe he's the Epic Games Unreal online learning producer or something.
Wow.
Yeah, something like that.
So he's kind of like a spokesperson for it.
Yeah, and he's also like an academic in like the real time like filmmaking kind of scene. And like that's the thing is like their whole their whole thing right now is getting Unreal into like as many hands as possible, right? Because it's like they want as many people to get in this, because once it becomes democratized, once people like me and you can get our hands on it, we're able to do things that just because of how we approach, filmmaking, not from a huge giant studio perspective, we will start to do things with it that
no megacorps here.
Yeah, that has never been done before. And you get all these, stories of like these tiny creators, right? Creating these amazing pieces of art because they take this new technology with their old like mindset of creating and create entirely new like procedures and entirely new like pipelines in and of itself. And the more people who get their hands on it,
innovation breeds innovation.
Yeah. And the more people who get their hands on it, the more innovation will happen, right? And it's like, and they want to just get it out there. It's like, it's part of why Unreal is free.
Yeah, which is insane. That the latest version of Unreal is free.
Yeah,
and it's also free. Like you don't have to pay any licensing fee. For it up to a certain
amount.
Right? Like you're
if you're making millions of dollars, like we want a little bit of
if you're making exactly. If you start making millions with your project, then you will have to pay the licensing fee. But the fact that they did that is really forward thinking, in my opinion. Like
for sure.
They are clearly thinking about the future of this technology in a way that most big corporations don't.
It's
right.
As
they
opposed to
like patent that stuff,
making it proprietary, and it's like
and then may charge exorbitant licensing fees to use it. But no, I actually have to applaud Epic Games, the developers of Unreal, for that.
Yeah.
The fact that they are like making it free to download and to use, and then making a minimum sales floor in order to trigger licensing fees. That's actually really cool, because that's going to enable a lot of small creators who can actually publish and distribute their work without having to pay for the medium that they used. That is awesome. And big shout outs to them for that. Corporations do wholesome stuff every once in a while. But I think everybody that seems to be involved in the virtual production space seems to have a pretty similar idea about exactly what I said, how much this is the future of filmmaking.
For sure.
Because this is going to empower so many people and so many filmmakers that we've never seen before doing innovative and interesting stuff that we've never seen before. And it makes me really excited for what the future holds. One last conclusory note. Let me add to the history, or perhaps present an alternate history, however you want to look at it.
Okay. Interesting.
Of a different way of interpreting the history of virtual production, though.
Okay.
Because I think virtual production has been in circulation widely longer than we like to admit, simply because I think there's a form of virtual production that was very popular in the 2000s and early 2010s.
Oh, I know what you're saying.
Did not call virtual production.
Yeah.
And that is machinima.
100% true. 100% true.
I think Rooster Teeth was a pioneer of virtual production that we don't often talk about, right? Because the Sims series they did, and then of course Red vs. Blue was their flagship show.
Longest running web series?
Yeah, longest running web series of all time.
Yeah.
It was used, right? It's a Halo machinima using the Halo video game to capture their filmmaking.
Yep.
That is real-time rendering.
Which is a game engine.
Right, that is a game engine and real-time rendering used for filmmaking application. And I didn't have this thought until I was working on the Dennis Chronicles Season 2 very recently. And I was sitting there navigating the scene in my virtual camera and positioning like these player characters in order to perform and puppet as actors. And I'm like, I'm doing virtual production right now.
It's like, wait a minute.
I just had to stop and think about it, right? And then I was animating them. I'm like, this is just virtual production. That's just what I've been doing. And then I thought about it. I was like, I made Halo machinimas back. I've been doing virtual production for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. Like when, what was it? Bungie? When, Red versus Blue, like, when that got big and they're like, hey, you know what? We're going to make our engine easier for you to make films in. And like, there's like that shortcut, or not shortcut. It's just the button combination to turn off crosshairs. And then they introduce theater mode
to drop your weapons.
Yeah, and like to toggle weapons up and down from like, stowing and up. It's like,
yeah, they started playing to that.
What they were doing was reverse engineering a 3D program from a video game.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And it's kind of mind blowing to think about. But I was like, yeah, that was a popular form of virtual production that a lot of people engaged in.
Yeah.
That now we don't often think about.
Yeah. And it's like being able to let a user, a person in the video game, control the camera immediately opens up tons of possibilities for filmmaking and for creativity in there, right? And now you have a bunch of stuff that were originally video games now getting turned into virtual production engines, right? Like think about SFM from like Source Filmmaker, right? Like that's a huge thing. Like tons of people now, actual real production animators caught their start in SFM.
Yeah. So, and again, SFM, basically machinima, but like it's somewhere between machinima and animation. And that's basically what most virtual production is.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of, I had this revelation recently. I was like, wow, we never called that virtual production, but that's what it is.
That's what it is. The
essence of
100%.
That was me.
You're correct.
Trying to act, like I got my filmmaking start in machinima. I owe a lot to the machinima medium. And when I think about it, like when I was a teenager, using video games to create movies, I was grasping at something that was bigger, right? Like I didn't have friends. I didn't have access to resources to create filmmaking. I didn't have a camera. I didn't have all sorts of things that were barriers to entry for filmmaking. But I had video games, and I could get in there and use the camera and the characters and everything to make movies. And that's what gave me my foundation in editing, in storytelling, visually. And it was me just grasping at filmmaking with the tools I had available. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially the spirit of virtual production. So in many 100%. Ways, I've been dying to get into virtual production lately. I'm going to be honest. I'm really wanting to get into that space. But I'm looking back at my history now. And I'm like,
your career?
I've been a virtual production. Yeah, my career, if you could call it that. I've been a virtual production person since the beginning.
Yeah,
and
that's where you started.
Really, these new innovations in the medium have just made me want to reconnect with my roots, is what I'm learning. Mm-hmm. And I think that's ultimately what that journey is to me. And I guess that's a bit of a personal note for me to end it on.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
That's essentially what this has meant to me now. And I realize that's part of what's gotten me so excited about it, because I realized the fact that it's using real-time rendering engines like Unreal and Unity is what also made me have that thought where I'm just like, well, you're basically just doing machinima at that point, right? It's basically just way more custom machinima is what we're getting into now. And that's amazing because that's going to elevate it to whole new heights and make it, very advanced techniques, very accessible to everyday people like myself. And so that's my personal stake in it. That's my story. I realized very recently that really I've been a virtual production person since the beginning. And it's very cool to see these innovations now changing the media landscape, that full-time professional filmmakers are now going in to the place where I started, which is basically making machinimas.
Yeah, basically. Now you have Jon Favreau, the machinimator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
No, completely blew my mind. Absolutely. That makes so much sense. I have nothing else to add to that.
Well, any closing statement from you then?
Oh, man. Well, I think just in terms of virtual productions, and you have this whole like open source wave that is going around right now, right? Like everybody's making open source, making like their technologies open source, or just making it free to use, or just making it generally more accessible. Democratization of art is, just what it comes down to. I think that's just a larger, that's not, I don't want to say symptom. That sounds like a bad thing, but it's like a manifestation of something that I think is becoming more and more prevalent like in our culture, which is just accessibility and making things and making, you know, the process of things a lot more accessible and democratized. And I think that's a really good thing. And I think creating tools that anybody can use and literally pick up, like you could right now at this moment download Unity or download Unreal and start making stuff, or like just, you know, download Blender and just start making stuff. That's awesome. Like I don't see a downside to that. Like there's obviously going to be like, you know, really weird innovations like with the AI stuff that's going on right now, but still the tools that are being made, like, you know, just a thing that I've always said, a tool is not a bad thing. A tool can be used for whatever. It's how the tool is used. It's the user of the tool. There's going to be like maybe some bad actors who are going to do some weird stuff with this new open source like stuff that's going on, but like I see it as a net good.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a good word for it. Awesome in the literal sense of the word.
Oh, absolutely.
I think we're going to be in awe in the explosion of creativity that we're already beginning to see. Let's be honest. Like, it's not like we're talking about it, you know, going over the history as a sort of retrospect right now.
Yeah.
But it's out there right now. Like, people are already using this stuff and doing amazing stuff with it. We'll definitely maybe post some of our favorites in the show notes as well.
Oh yeah, for sure.
A few virtual production projects that we're eager to show more people. But yeah, really awesome stuff. And yeah, that'll probably wrap up our little deep dive on virtual production. Mm-hmm. Thank you all very much for listening. This has been the Hypercube podcast. This show is edited by Loryn Pacheco, mixed by Raphael Pacheco, with original theme music by Mono Memory. Until next time, we'll see you all later. God bless.
Bye.